I think war is terrible, but that it is inevitable, that compulsory military service is as inevitable as death, and that since government will always desire it, war will always exist. So writes this talented and sincere writer, who is endowed with the power of penetrating to the most innermost core of the subject, which is the essence of the poetic faculty. He brings before us all the cruelty of inconsistency between men's moral sense and their action, but without trying to remove it, seems to admit that this inconsistency must exist, and that it is the poetic tragedy of life. Another no less gifted writer, Edward Rod, paints in still more vivid colors the cruelty and madness of the present state of things. He too only aims at presenting its tragic features, without suggesting or foreseeing any issue from the position. What is the good of doing anything? What is the good of undertaking any enterprise? And how are we to love men in these troubled times when every fresh day is a menace of danger? All we have begun, the plans we are developing are schemes of work. The little good we may have been able to do, will it not be swept away by the tempest that is in preparation? Everywhere the earth is shaking under our feet and storm clouds are gathering on our horizon, which will have no pity on us. Ah, if all we had to dread were the revolution which is held up as a spectre to terrify us. Since I cannot imagine a society more detestable than ours, I feel more skeptical and alarmed in regard to that which will replace it. If I should have to suffer from the change, I should be consoled by thinking that the executioners of that day were the victims of the previous time, and the hope of something better would help us to endure the worst. But it is not the remote peril which frightens me. I see another danger, near and far more cruel because there is no excuse for it, because it is absurd, because it can lead to no good. Every day one balances the chances of war on the morrow. Every day they become more merciless. The imagination revolts before the catastrophe which is coming at the end of our century as the goal of the progress of our era, and yet we must get used to facing it. For 20 years past, every resource of science has been exhausted in the invention of engines and destruction, and soon a few charges of cannon will suffice to annihilate a whole army. No longer a few thousand of poor devils, who were paid a price for their blood, are kept under arms, but whole nations are under arms to cut each other's throats. They are robbed of their time now by compulsory service, and they may be robbed of their lives later. To prepare them for the work of massacre, their hatred is kindled by persuading them that they are hated. And peaceable men let themselves be played on us, and go and fall on one another with the ferocity of wild beasts. Furious troops of peaceful citizens taking up arms at an empty word of command, for some ridiculous question of frontiers or colonial trade interest, heaven only knows what. They will go like sheep to the slaughter, knowing all the while why they are going, knowing that they are leaving their wives, knowing that their children will want for food, full of misgivings, yet intoxicated by the fine-sounding lies that are dinned into their ears. They will march without revolt, passive resigned, though the numbers and the strength are theirs, and they might, if they knew how to cooperate together, establish the reign of good sense and fraternity, instead of barbarous trickery of diplomacy. They will march to battle so deluded, so duped, that they will believe slaughter to be a duty, and they will ask the benediction of God on their lust for blood. They will march to battle, trampling underfoot the harvest they have sown, burning the towns they have built with songs of triumph, festive music, and cries of jubilation, and their sons will raise statue to those who have done most in their slaughter. The destiny of the whole generation depends on the hour in which some ill-fated politician may give the signal that will be followed. We know that the best of us will be cut down and our work will be destroyed in embryo. We know it and tremble with rage, but we can do nothing. We are held fast in the toils of officialdom and red tape, and too rude a shock would be needed to set us free. We are enslaved by the laws we set up for our protection, which have become our oppression. We are but the tools of that autocratic abstraction, the state, which enslaves each individual in the name of the will of all, who would all, taken individually, desire exactly the opposite of what they will be made to do. And if they were only a generation, it must be sacrificed, but there are graver interests at stake. The paid politicians, the ambitious statesmen who exploit the evil passions of the populace, and the imbeciles who are deluded by fine-sounding phrases, have so embittered national feuds that the existence of a whole race will be at stake in the war of the morrow. One of the elements that constitute the modern world is threatened. The conquered people will be wiped out of existence, and whichever it may be, we shall see a moral force annihilated, as if there were too many forces to work for good. We shall have a new Europe formed on foundations so unjust, so brutal, so sanguinary, stained with so monstrous a crime, that it cannot be but worse than the Europe of today, more iniquitous, more barbarous, more violent. Thus one feels crushed under the weight of an immense discouragement. We are struggling in the cul-de-sac with muskets aimed at us from the housetops. Our labor is like that of sailors executing their last task on the ship before it sinks. Our pleasure are those of the condemned victim, who was offered his choice of dainties a quarter of an hour before his execution. Thought is paralyzed by anguish, and the most it is capable of it is to calculate, interpreting the vague phrases of ministers, spelling out the sense of the speeches of sovereigns, and ruminating on the words attributed to diplomats reported on the certain authority of the newspapers, whether it is to be tomorrow or the day after, this year or the next, that we are to be murdered, so that one might seek in vain in history an epoch more insecure, more crushed under the weight of suffering. Here it is pointed out that the force is in the hands of those who work their own destruction, in the hands of the individual men who make up the masses. It is pointed out that the source of the evil is the government. It would seem evident that the contradiction between life and conscience had reached the limit beyond which it cannot go, and after reaching this limit, some solution of it must be found. But the author does not think so. He sees in this the tragedy of human life, and after depicting all the horror of the position, he concludes that human life must be spent in the midst of his horror. And so much for the attitude of war to those who regard it as something tragic and fated by destiny. The third category consists of men who have lost all conscience and consequently all common sense and feeling of humanity. To this category belongs Moltke, whose opinion has been quoted above by Maupassant, and the majority of military men who have been educated in this cruel superstition live by it, and consequently are often in all simplicity convinced that war is not only inevitable, but even a necessary and beneficial thing. This is also the view of some civilians, so-called educated and cultivated men. Here is what the celebrated academician Camille Duchoux writes in reply to the editor of the Revue de Revue, where several letters on war were published together. Dear Sir, when you ask the least warlike of academicians whether he is a partisan of war, his answer is known beforehand. Alas, sir, you yourself speak of the pacific ideal inspiring your generous compatriots as a dream. During my life I have heard a great many good people protest against this frightful custom of international butchery, which all admit and deplore, but how is it to be remedied? Often, too, there have been attempts to suppress dueling. One would fancy that seemed an easy task, but not at all. All that has been done hitherto with that noble object has never been and never will be of use. All the congresses of both hemispheres may vote against war, and against dueling too, but above all arbitrations, conventions, and legislations there will always be the personal honor of individual men, who have always been demanding dueling, and the interest of nations, which will always demand war. I wish none the less for the depth of my heart that the Congress of Universal Peace may succeed at last in its very honorable and difficult enterprise. I am, dear sir, Camille Duchoux. The upshot of this is that personal honor requires men to fight, and the interest of nations require them to ruin and exterminate each other. As for the efforts to abolish war, they call for nothing but a smile. The opinion of another well-known academician, Jules Claret, is of the same kind. Dear sir, he writes, for a man of sense, there can be but one opinion on the subject of peace and war. Humanity is created to live free, to perfect and ameliorate its fate by peaceful labor. The general harmony preached by the Universal Peace Congress is but a dream, perhaps, but at least it is the fairest of all dreams. Man is always looking toward the promised land, and there the harvests are to ripen with no fear of their being torn up by shells or crushed by cannon wheels. But since philosophers and philanthropists are not the controlling powers, it is well for our soldiers to guard our frontiers and home, and their arms, skillfully used, are perhaps the surest guarantee of the peace we all love. Peace is a gift only granted to the strong and the resolute. I am, dear sir, Jules Claret. The upshot of this letter is that there is no harm in talking about what no one intends or feels obliged to do. But when it comes to practice, we must fight. And here now is a view lately expressed by the most popular novelist in Europe, Émile Zola. I regard war as a fatal necessity, which appears inevitable for us from its close connection with human nature and the whole constitution of the world. I should wish that war could be put off for the longest possible time. Nevertheless, the moment will come when we shall be forced to go to war. I am considering at this moment from the standpoint of universal humanity, and making no reference to our misunderstanding with Germany, a most trivial incident in the history of mankind. I say that war is necessary and beneficial, since it seems one of the conditions of existence for humanity. War confronts us everywhere, not only war between different races and people, but war, too, in private and family life. It seems one of the principal elements of progress, and every step in advance that humanity has taken hitherto has been attended by bloodshed. Men have talked and still talk of disarmament, while disarmament is something impossible to which, even if it were possible, we ought not to consent. I am convinced that a general disarmament throughout the world would involve something like a moral decadence, which would show itself in general feebleness and would hinder the progressive advancement of humanity. A warlike nation has always been strong and flourishing. The art of war has led the development of all the other arts. History bears witness to it. So in Athens and in Rome, commerce, manufacture, and literally never attained so high a point of development as when those cities were mastered of the whole world by force of arms. To take an example from times near our own, we may recall the age of Louis XIV. The wars of the Grand Monarch were not only no hindrance to the progress of the arts and sciences, but even on the contrary, seemed to have promoted and favored their development. So war is a beneficial thing? But the best expression of this attitude is the view of the most gifted of writers of this school, the academician de Vogue. That is what he writes in an article of the military section of the exhibition of 1889. On the Esplanade des Invalides, among the exotic and colonial encampments, a building of more severe style overawes the picturesque bazaar. All these fragments of the globe have come to gather round the Palace of War, and in turn our guests mount guard submissively before the mother building. But for whom they would not be here? Fine subject for the antithesis of rhetoric, of humanitarians who could not fail to whimper over this juxtaposition, and to say that, Sisi tura sila, that the union of the nations through science and labor will overcome the instinct of war. Let us leave them to cherish the chimera of golden age, which would soon become, if it could be realized, an age of mud. All history teaches us that the one is created for the other, that blood is needed to hasten and cement the union of the nations. Natural science has ratified in our day the mysterious law revealed to Joseph de Maistre by the intuition of his genius and by meditation on fundamental truth. He saw the world redeeming itself from hereditary degeneration by sacrifice. Science shows it advancing to perfection through struggle and violent selection. There is a statement of the same law in both, expressed in different formulas. The statement is disagreeable, no doubt, but the laws of the world are not made for our pleasure. They are made for our progress. Let us enter this inevitable, necessary palace of war. We shall be able to observe there how the most tenacious of our instincts, without losing any of its vigor, is transformed and adopted to the varying exigencies of historical epoch. M. de Vogue finds the necessity for war, according to his view, well expressed by the two great writers, Joseph de Maistre and Darwin, whose statement he likes so much that he quotes from them again. Dear Sir, he writes to the editor of Revue de Revue, you ask me my view to the possible success of the Universal Congress of Peace. I hold with Darwin that violent struggle is a law of nature which overrules all other laws. I hold with Joseph de Maistre that it is a divine law, two different ways of describing the same thing. If by some impossible chance a fraction of human society, all the civilized West, let us suppose, were to succeed in suspending the action of this law, some races of stronger instincts would undertake the task of putting it into action against us. Those races would vindicate nature's reasoning against human reason. They would be successful because the certainty of peace, I do not say peace, I say the certainty of peace, would in half a century engender a corruption and a decadence more destructive for mankind than the worst of wars. I believe that we must do with war, the criminal law of humanity, as with all our criminal laws, that is, soften them, put them in force as rarely as possible, use every effort to make their application unnecessary. But all the experience of history teaches us that they cannot be altogether suppressed so long as two men are left on earth, with bread, money, and a woman between them. I should be very happy if the Congress would prove me in error, but I doubt if it can prove history, nature, and God in error also. This amounts to saying that history, human nature, and God show us that so long as there are two men, bread, money, and a woman, there will be war. That is to say that no progress will lead men to rise above the savage conception of life with regard to no participation of bread, money is good in this context, and women, possibly without fighting. They are strange people, these men who assemble in Congress, and make speeches to show us how to catch birds by putting salt on their tails, though they must know it is impossible to do. And amazing are they too, who, like Maupassant, Rod, and many others, see clearly all the horrors of war, all the inconsistency of men not doing what is needful, right, and beneficial for them to do, who lament over the tragedy of life, and do not see that the whole tragedy is at the end directly men, ceasing to take account of any unnecessary consideration, refuse to do what is hateful and disastrous to them. They are amazing people truly, but those who, like De Volg and others, who, professing the doctrine of evolution, regard war as not only inevitable but beneficial and therefore desirable, they are terrible, hideous in their moral perversion. The others, at least, say that they hate evil and love good, but these openly declare that good and evil do not exist. All discussion of the possibility of re-establishing peace instead of everlasting war is the pernicious sentimentality of phrasemongers. There is a law of evolution by which it allows that I must live and act in an evil way. What is to be done? I am an educated man. I know the law of evolution, and therefore I will act in an evil way. There is the law of evolution, and therefore there is neither good nor evil, and one must live for the sake of one's personal existence, leaving the rest to the action of the law of evolution. This is the last word of refined culture, and with it, of that overshadowing of conscience which has come up upon the educated classes of our time. The desire of the educated classes to support the ideas they prefer, and the order of existence based on them, has attained its further limits. They lie and delude themselves, and one another, with their subtlest forms of deception, simply to obscure, to deaden conscience. Instead of transforming their life into harmony with their conscience, they try by every means to stifle its voice. But it is in darkness that the light begins to shine, and so the light is rising upon our epoch. End of chapter.